very pleased to be welcoming everyone here today. This is a Sakharov seminar on human rights, part of the Sakharov series here at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. This obviously comes at a time when a terrible war is underway, waged by the Russian government against Ukraine. The original timing of the seminar had to do with the appeal that Memorial, the renowned human rights group in Russia, had filed, which was adjudicated yesterday by an appellate board. And not surprisingly, that appellate board, which is a three-person panel from the Supreme Court, ruled against Memorial and in favor of the Russian Supreme Court's decision. So we'll be hearing more about that today. And it came yesterday. So this seminar comes the day after Memorial has lost its last appeal. But it also comes, and this was coincidental, it comes at a time of the terrible war that Russian President Vladimir Putin is waging against Ukraine. So that issue too, the connection between domestic repression in Russia as reflected in the closure of Memorial, and then the foreign repression, foreign violence that Putin's administration is waging currently will be discussed today. And I am going to be one of the speakers. So chairing the panel will be Nadia Boyajieva, who is a professor of international relations and international law at the Balkan Studies Institute of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. She is also a professor at Plovdiv University and is a long-term visiting scholar at Harvard's Davis Center, and is going to be chairing the panel and coordinating questions and the like. So please, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let me welcome everyone here today. I'm very pleased to be chairing this important session, which comes at a time of tragic violence perpetrated by the Russian government against Ukraine. Today's speakers, as Mark mentioned, will be discussing both the closure of Memorial in Russia and Russia's escalating war in Ukraine. We have three speakers today. Joshua Rubenstein, for many years, was the New England Regional Director of Amnesty International and is now the Associate Director for Major Gifts at Harvard Law School and an associate of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Tatiana Yankelevich was formerly director of Harvard's Sakharov Program on Human Rights and is now an associate of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Mark Kramer is director of Cold War Studies and a senior fellow at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Each speaker will begin with 10-12 minutes of preliminary remarks, and we will then turn the audience questions and wider discussion. Please go ahead, Joshua.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Mark, for helping organize today's discussion. With all the focus on Ukraine, let me begin with some remarks about the history and fate of Memorial. For me, Memorial has been and is likely to remain the most tangible legacy of the Soviet human rights movement. Its founders, among them Andrei Sakharov and Sergei Kovalyov, its longtime leader Arseny Raginsky, the involvement of Alexander Sanya Daniel, among others, cut their teeth as active participants in the challenging years of the Brezhnev period. My last visit to their offices in Moscow was at the invitation of Larisa Bogoraz. We sat at a table from which we could view a dramatic exhibit and set of images of well-known figures in the movement who had passed away, among them her two husbands, Yuli Daniel and Anatoly Marchenko. Let me add that I've been thinking often of Larisa this past week. Born in Kharkiv, she spoke Ukrainian. I can only imagine how appalled and angry she would be over the current invasion and war. We can only speculate over the timing of Memorial's closing and how connected its fate is to Putin's plans to launch an attack on Ukraine. First, we need to recognize that we cannot separate this from the long list of murders and assassinations that have characterized his rule. The fate of Anna Politkovskaya, Natalia Stamirova, Boris Nemtsov, the poisoning and now the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, along with the crackdown on his party and colleagues, the attacks on British soil of Alexander Litvinenko and Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia Skripal, then of Vladimir Karamurza on 2 separate occasions from which he miraculously survived poisoning. All of this embodies the work of a lawless regime that will stop at nothing to silence independent voices for speaking up for the truth and historical memory. Astonishing, really, that Putin waited so long to set his sights on Memorial. Perhaps any reluctance on his part reflected the widespread following it enjoys and its ability to galvanize supporters. Memorial has branches in 60 cities across Russia. Let's remember some of its most well-known projects. Return of the Names, a public reading of thousands of names of Stalin's victims held in front of the Lubyanka at the end of October, a tradition that lasted a number of years. The Topography of Terror, an online map of Moscow highlighting places where repression was carried out in the capital. Last Address, the placing of plaques on apartment buildings where victims were last residing before they were disappeared. This set of memorial echoes the Stumbling Stone Project in Germany and elsewhere, where teams of volunteers have been placing bronze memorials in the sidewalks, in front of houses or apartment buildings, where victims of the Holocaust were last residing before they were taken away. Memorial volunteers have been discovering mass graves. Let's keep in mind the fate of Yuri Dmitriev, who had been documenting a mass grave in Karelia, near the border with Finland. Working in the archives, he was able to identify the names of thousands of Stalin's victims. Convicted of trumped-up charges, he is now facing 15 years in prison for this work. Thanks to Memorial, we have a current list of more than 400 political prisoners in Russia today. Another 1,500 cases were brought to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, to the chagrin of Putin. Its database contains more than 3 million cases of Stalin's victims, plus the names of 42,000 members of the secret police between 1935 and 1939. All of this work marked an ongoing challenge and rebuke to a regime of falsehoods and lies. In the end, the Kremlin resorted to flimsy charges, invoking the severe requirements of the so-called foreign agents law to close down Memorial. Dedicated to national memory and defending human rights today, Memorial was the kind of organized movement that, apparently for Putin, could not be allowed to continue. We like to think that all governments, all regimes, have a threshold of embarrassment, but Putin challenges this assumption. To say publicly in an address to the Russian people that he had no choice but to invade Ukraine because of the alleged genocide it was carrying out against Russian speakers, that he needed to act against the drug addicts and Nazis who were leading Ukraine without a hint of irony, reveals the depth of cynicism that has animated his regime for decades. Just as prosecutors declared that Memorial was whitewashing Nazi criminals, that it was distorting the history of World War II, so Putin invokes a similar demagoguery when he attacks Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is an attack on democracy, a war against a Slavic nation on Russia's border, whose respect for democratic values and human rights cannot be allowed to stand as an example to the Russian people. But as Putin becomes bogged down in this offensive, and even if the Russian army succeeds in reaching Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa, it is hard to understand what he can hope to accomplish. The population of over 40 million people despises him. The international community is unlikely to walk away from the sanctions it has already imposed. There are already tens of thousands of Russians in the streets who have demonstrated their opposition to this war. I would like to cite the words of a famous son of Ukraine, no less a figure than Leon Trotsky, who wrote in his memoir, My Life, in history, war has often been the mother of revolution. I don't pretend to be an experienced military analyst, but I don't see Putin's so-called end game here. If he thought he could subdue Ukraine easily, he has learned that is not the case. If he thought he could remove Zelensky and replace him with a compliant stooge of his picking, that hardly seems possible. If he thinks he can occupy and pacify the population, is he really prepared to dispatch how many tens of thousands of more soldiers to occupy a country that is larger than France? Does he think he can reestablish Russia's standing in the world without a full-scale withdrawal? Can the Russian economy be sustained with all the sanctions that have been imposed and more that could follow? In his classic History of Russia, the British historian Bernard Pears noted that when the conservative and deeply repressive Tsar Nicholas I died in March 1855, to quote, with him fell in ruins the system which his personality was everywhere regarded as the incarnation. His son, the new Tsar Alexander II, soon surprised Russia with a history of reforms. For Sir Bernard, the lesson was clear, that Russian history has often been marked by the ebb and flow of repression and reform. We should not take for granted that a successor to Putin, whenever that comes, will be ready to continue the pattern of his rule. If Khrushchev and the Thaw could succeed Stalin, if Gorbachev and Perestroika could succeed Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, then it is entirely possible that a new generation of leaders, whatever their ties to Putin, could choose to lead Russia in a more hopeful direction. When the Warsaw Pact armies invaded Czechoslovakia in August 1968, there were protests within the former Soviet Union. People threw leaflets on the street, painted slogans on walls, and most famously, 8 men and women stood with a banner in Red Square, invoking the well-known defense of Polish independence from the Russian Empire in the 19th century, for your freedom and ours. We know from news reports that thousands of people in cities across Russia have taken to the streets to demonstrate their opposition to the war. As many as 1,700 have been arrested. In light of Putin's well-known impatience with street protests, it is remarkable how many people are risking their future prospects to voice their opposition. For me, the need to defend Memorial and the defense of Ukraine are part and parcel of the same courageous struggle between two Russias, the Russia of violence and deceit and the Russia of justice and humanity. Thank you.
You're muted.
I apologize. Thank you very much, Joshua. Our next speaker will be Tatiana Yankilevich. Please go ahead. The floor is yours, Tatiana.
Thank you, Nadia. And thank you, Mark, very much for making this possible. And thank you, Joshua, for the extremely apt and deeply moving remarks. I would like to start with a reference to 2014. This was for the 25th anniversary of the founding of Memorial Society, Общество Memorial. In early 2014, before the events, the spring events, I was asked to write a short statement, a short um, thought, so to speak, for the Memorial's website on the request of Memorial's board. And that was the 25th anniversary of the founding of Memorial. And I would like to quote that statement in full now, so we could see the difference between the now and then. On January 16, 1992, in an essay entitled The Fate of One Family and the State Security Agencies, my mother, Elena Bonner, wrote, "The history of our country is a lie. My family's story is but one example of the lies of investigative cases and indictments during the period of violations of Soviet legality. The lies of death certificates issued by the registry offices on the basis of the false death certificates during the exposure of the so-called cult of personality period and the rehabilitation of its victims. And finally, the lies of the era of perestroika in 1988 and 1989, when the highest authorities lied to Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov about the fate of his papers while they were being burned." End of quote. The work and the existence of Memorial Society is one of the few reasons not to lose hope for the preservation of historical memory in our country, marred in lies. Historical memory in today's Russia is both important and vulnerable. In Russia, there was no awareness of the past. There was no real condemnation of the crimes of Stalin times, crimes committed by the KGB and the Communist Party. Over the past decade, archives have been closed, history textbooks have been revised and edited in accordance with the new imperial policy. Soviet symbols and even the old anthem, of the USSR have been returned. There is a robbery of the historical memory of the entire country. This entails serious consequences for the Russian civil society. Where there is no memory of the arbitrariness of the Soviet legal system, there is no understanding of the importance of law and the need for the rule of law. Where there is no memory of what the Soviet police did in the past, it is easier to accept a police state today. Not knowing the history of terror and suffering caused by the Soviet Empire, people turn a blind eye to the new attempts and sometimes even support these attempts to enslave their neighbors. I am deeply convinced that the work of the Memorial Society is urgently needed in order to resist this robbery, this lie, in order for our country, our fellow citizens, not to fall into existential amnesia, not to turn into the mankurti, the term invented by Chingiz Aitmatov, if you want to look it up in Russian. And in order for the hope that should not perish for the human desire, and I will quote Boris Pasternak, to work together and in unison with everyone and in accord with the rule of law. Труда со всеми сообща и заодно с правопорядком in original. This was written in January 2014. Since then, much has happened. Crimea was annexed by Russia and remains occupied. Ukraine was destabilized by Russian undercover operations in the Luhansk-Donetsk region under false pretexts of protection of Russian population. A passenger Boeing was shot down by the polite men, вежливые человечки, in the separatist republics. Civic society in Russia suffered increasingly severe repression by the Putin regime. Finally, Memorial itself was put on trial and proscribed. And the small victorious war began just under a week ago, accompanied by the nuclear threats to the entire human community by the irresponsible and despotic ruler of Russia, Vladimir Putin. I wish to close with two quotes. One from Sakharov. Andrei Sakharov said that any sane person finding oneself on the edge of a precipice first must stand back. The humanity must stand back from nuclear disaster and suicide. The end of quote. Here comes the question of sanity of the Russian leadership. And the other quote I wish to bring up here is from Sergei Kovalyov, another founder of Memorial Society. Shortly before he died, he was asked on Sakharov's 100th birthday, how would Sakharov feel today? What does Sergei Kovalyov think about it? And Sergei Kovalyov responded, Sakharov would be ashamed. I completely agree with that. But I want to add to it that Sakharov would not only be ashamed, he would also be acting. He will be doing all he can to stop this carnage, this bloodshed, this crime against humanity. And so should we. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I'm giving the floor now to our last speaker, Mark Kramer.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadia, and thank you very much also to Josh and to Tatiana for very eloquent and powerful presentations. I will pick up on a few of these things just to say that Memorial existed in the late Soviet era. It was a product of, as Josh mentioned, was a product of the Gorbachev era when people had great interest, people in the Soviet Union at that time, for the first time in really their lives, had the opportunity to try to learn about the past and about the terrible crimes that had been committed in their country and that had often been perpetrated against their own families. There was great interest in learning about that at that time in the late 80s into the early 90s. And people would line up to buy the latest publications that would go over these things, go over some of these atrocities. And the key, one of the major reasons for that was Memorial's role in trying to shed light on the past and opening up as much material as possible. And that role continued throughout the post-Soviet era until Memorial has now been closed. But Memorial itself did accumulate, as Josh was mentioning, so much material and published so much about what had happened during the Stalin period and later, that it really is impossible even for a Putin's regime to try to put that, to try to cover it up permanently. Certainly they have downplayed it and done their best to try to resuscitate a kind of tolerance of and even admiration of Stalin. But still, it's not something that can be permanent. That what Memorial did in conjunction with other invaluable organizations like the International Democracy Foundation that Alexander Yakovlev headed, that it's going to be there for future generations of Russians. And the real question will be who will come along to try to get Russians interested in that material again. And so long as Putin is there, it's not going to happen. But at some point in the future, it will. So I'm confident that even though Memorial lost its final appeal yesterday, which was not at all surprising. That is, after the Supreme Court ruled against the two branches of Memorial in late December, it was very clear that the appeal wasn't going to work, even though it had to be filed. But even so, some of the people involved in Memorial and ideally the younger generations as well will want to know why such terrible crimes were perpetrated in their country. And that was the guiding motif of Memorial from the very beginning, and it is going to be the driving motif of any such effort in the future. So that brings me to what the current crime, which is the war being perpetrated now by Vladimir Putin against and the Russian government, and many with a great deal of support in Russia. There is a heartening opposition to the war, including well-known people, athletes, artists, actors and actresses, many others who have spoken out. But there is also a dismayingly high percentage of Russians who either are acquiescent in the war or are actively supportive of it. There are some I know who are and have basically gone along with it, that I find shameful. So that does bring me though to, in the future, one of the driving motifs, I think, for a revival of a memorial type organization will be looking back at this terrible war, the war for no purpose, as it's been called widely on the Russian internet sites. So the purpose of it, though there is in fact a purpose, which is to consolidate the autocracy that Putin has been developing in Russia over the last 22 years, that I don't think it's accidental that the crackdown over the last year and a half, but particularly over the last year that Putin has launched, including the closure of Memorial, even though it had its roots earlier, going back to the 2012 foreign agent law and the subsequent laws that were adopted in 2013, 2014 that became part of the campaign against Memorial. So it dates back, as both Josh and Tatiana mentioned, for a decade. But still, it's the last year in which Putin has essentially gotten rid of any potential opposition to moves he can make, and that again, that helps to explain the timing of the closure of Memorial and the timing of this war. What he hadn't counted on, though, I think, is even though various laws have been adopted and various crackdowns have been implemented to try to deter people from protesting and to try to make it impossible for people really to organize anything by way of multi-person protests. Even single people, individuals going out and holding signs have been arrested. So if multiple people go out, it's bound to generate a response from the MVD or the FSB. Even so, as both Josh and Tatiana mentioned, there have been thousands of people who have gone out. It doesn't outweigh the millions, even tens of millions, who have been acquiescent in or supportive of a war, but it does show, though, that there is still a very positive and favorable segment of Russian society that isn't willing to go along with the kind of repression that Memorial was originally set up and continued to investigate and continue to investigate for more than 30 years. So in looking then at the closure of Memorial and now of the war underway, I'm reminded of almost to the day 7 years ago. Tatiana and I happened to be in Moscow at the same time, and we went to the funeral of Boris Nemtsov, the opposition figure who was murdered on most likely at the behest of either Ramzan Kadyrov or Vladimir Putin. I suspect more likely Kadyrov, but again, it'll not be known until many years from now, because most such investigations go nowhere in Russia, and that has certainly been the case here. But regardless of which of those figures ordered his assassination, there was no question that it marked a turning point in Russia and Russian politics. And there were figures from Memorial, which had already been branded a foreign agent, but there were figures from Memorial, including Sergei Kovalyov, who came to the funeral. And then Kovalyov had his 85th birthday party, which Tatiana and I also went to soon thereafter. And I remember at that party in particular, there were senior people who spoke very positively about Nemtsov. I was surprised, people like Vladimir Putin, because they had generally been very deferential to Putin. But I think that atrocity, the crime that was committed in murdering Nemtsov was so great that they were willing to speak out more openly. And I hope that is what is happening now with the really grotesque war that Putin is waging against Ukraine, that more people will be willing to speak out. I mean, it's not only people like Deripaska and Friedman who have offered mild statements of disapproval, but I'm hoping that there will be others who will somehow be able to turn things around. I don't have great hope for that, because I think, again, Putin has shown himself to be such a malevolent figure on the Russian scene that he'll be able to fend off even such opposition, just as he crushed Memorial. But still, there's at least the thousands of people who have gone out onto the streets, I think does give some, at least small reason for hope. So with that, I will turn it back to Nadia.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mark. And thank you all for sticking to the time limit. And I would like to ask our audience to raise people from the audience. We have a lot of participants on Zoom and a lot of on YouTube. I would like to ask you to take part in the discussion and raise your questions to our dear participants in the panel.
The Q&A section, Nadia, has questions.
So first of all, I would like there are two questions that are connected with the fate of Memorial and the documents which were collected during all those years by Memorial. So one is of the questions is I'm going to combine the questions. The questions are related to the fate of the documents, the immense collections. The question is from Kara Kaufman is when museums and archives, she says, closed here in the United States, the government takes over the distribution and preservation of the documents and artifacts. And her question is, what will happen to them in Russia? Will they be preserved? And one more question is about again the records and the documents. So our listeners and participants are worried about the future of these documents. And since Tatiana mentioned about historical memory, I think that we should answer to this question. So I don't know, Mark or Tatiana.
I'll let Josh and I think we
Tatiana,
all.
maybe, and Josh.
Josh, you're muted.
Josh, please.
I defer to Mark and Tatiana.
Well, Tatiana, maybe you raised the topic of historical memory and about those huge collections that Memorial was taking care of, and what will happen with those documents. It is very important for future generations.
Tatiana, you're muted.
I keep forgetting about unmuting. Thank you for that question. I find that this is really one of the most central concerns when it comes to the new conditions in which Memorial finds itself in today's Russia. And I referred to a little used, seldom used term mankurte in my remarks earlier, and I just want to explain what that entails, what kind of meaning was imbued into this word by the author Chingiz Aytmatov. These are the people whose heads were shrunk by special. This is, of course, a fantastic image. Their heads were shrunk with a metal ring, not allowing the brain to develop properly. And therefore, these people had no recollection, these creatures, rather, I would say, had no recollection of affinity with other people, such as even their own parents, their mother, for example. And they were cruel, senselessly cruel, and they were not able to relate to the rest of humanity, to their fellow human beings. And this is what the policy, the consistent policy of the last almost 22 years has been carrying out, shrinking the minds, the consciousness, the mental ability to recognize its affinity with the rest of human race. This is what has been happening in Russia. And I think that Memorial, to me, was in those years before the more recent turn of events, when it was still able to carry out its mission to some degree with some difficulties, but was still able to do so, was the Memorial was preserving that affinity with human community. And the recent events make it very, very hard for Memorial to even preserve the historical memory that it has been able to amass so far. And to go to the practical side of this issue, I know that there have been some ideas and possibly even arrangements for the Memorial archive to be protected and preserved in some other country. Of course, it remains to be seen how, in practical terms, it would be possible to hand over the artifacts, the physical documents to under the present conditions of the state of war in Russia. How would that be possible to preserve them in physical condition? That worries me no end, I admit. And I am very, very much concerned for the fate of the unique and extremely important, hard to overestimate the importance of the memorial's archive.
Yeah, let me add that there were, going back to the time 9 years or so ago when Memorial was first branded a foreign agent, there did begin some attempts to try to back up, to make backup copies of some of the documents. But again, because of the immense size of the archive that Memorial had accumulated, on many issues, but particularly the victims of the Stalinist repression, that it was a very slow process to back up as much as possible. Over the last couple of years, as it became evident that the campaign waged by the authorities was taking an ominous turn, it did begin to speed up, but again, there were practical constraints on how much could be done, especially in the absence of any ability to receive foreign assistance. So had there been the opportunity for to have foreign archivists come in as well to help with the process, to help with equipment, to help with large external drives and cloud archives, then it would have sped up the process and made it easier. However, I do want to say there is a great deal that is backed up. I spoke with some of the Memorial people back in, I believe it was September or October of last year. And they do have quite, at least, what they see as the core collections. There is quite a bit backed up. But there does remain this important concern that under the circumstances of the current Russian government, and especially the current Russian president, that there won't be any guarantee of the safety of that archive for at least the next decade or more. So there's really going to be this period, this interregnum in which the fate of the archive and of a great deal of what Memorial collected will be in doubt. And unfortunately, there was, again, given the context, it would have been hard to avoid that. But again, I don't want to say that everything would be lost. There's a great deal that will be maintained, and quite a bit that was published. Records by people like Nikita Petrov, for example, about the NKVD and the KGB. So their records can't be wiped out entirely, but it does remain a concern. Having said that, and let me add just one final thing. The archival situation in Russia, at least until, well, even into this month, I can't say what the case is now during the war, but the archival situation has actually been the opposite of the autocracy, the autocratic trends that Putin has implemented over the last 10 years since returning as president. That even as the political situation has deteriorated and and repression has escalated, the archival situation has actually improved. So it's not to say it's perfect, it never has been, but it was, as of earlier this month, better than it had been in the 1990s, for example. So I am hopeful, although not terribly, but I'm somewhat hopeful that situation will continue, and perhaps there won't be the grave threat to Memorial's holdings that might have occurred had that not been the case.
Thank you very much, Mark and Tanya and Josh. We have another set of questions that are related more to the current situation in Ukraine. And we have a question from Mark Steinberg, who is asking, what are his question is about the Putin motives and his rationality. And would you like to comment on this? And I would add here to this question another point. Ivan Krstev, fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and an expert in international relations, in his opinion article in New York Times, published on the 3rd of February, so well before the invasion in Ukraine, under the title "Europe thinks Putin is planning something even worse than war," he's talking about how America and Europe are speculating about motives, and that America and Europe are not divided on what Mr. Putin wants. And I'm citing here, the Kremlin wants a symbolic break from 1990s, bearing the post-Cold War order. That would take the form of a new European security architecture that recognizes Russia's sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space and rejects the universality of the Western values. Rather than the restoration of the Soviet Union, the goal is the recovery of what Mr. Putin regards as historic Russia. So this article was written again on the 3rd of February, so it was well before the Russian invasion. That's why I would like to speak a little bit. What will be your comments about the motives, the intentions, why this war is needed to restore historic Russia, or to change the European security architecture that was created after the end of the Cold War? Maybe Mark?
Well, I'll let Josh, do you want to comment? I mean,
I think it's very hard to speculate specific reasons. I think there are several reasons. I do think the issue of democracy in Ukraine and the fact that other countries that used to be under Soviet sway have joined NATO is one factor. But I can't believe that any serious person in Russia thinks that NATO is a threat to Russia. I think that's a bit manufactured. I think the issue of democracy is more pertinent here. And secondly, that Ukraine, as a Slavic country on the borders of Russia, poses a kind of example that Putin could not tolerate. I think that's probably more to the point, but we'll never know unless Putin owns up honestly to what this was all about. And maybe we'll know, unfortunately, if Russian armies take control of Kiev and other major cities, we'll see what they try to accomplish. But as I said earlier, I think his end game is very uncertain and could lead as much to Putin's undoing as to further destruction of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Josh has said. Let me add though, there is that Russia has had a sphere of influence for the last 30 years. The West has not really prevented Russia from taking quite repeated action against former Soviet republics. That began in 1992 and 1993 in Georgia, when the Russian government supported movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia that then de facto broke away, and that was later consolidated by Russia's own intervention, direct intervention, large-scale intervention against Georgia in August 2008. But also in 1992, Russian troops were used in Moldova, in Transnistria, to break that region away from Moldova, and those troops are still there to this day, despite repeated requests from the Moldovan government to have them removed. Russian troops intervened in Tajikistan in a civil war and basically consolidated the rule of the pro-Russian side in that civil war. In the early 90s, the Russian government was supporting a separatist movement in Crimea led by Yuri Meshkov. And Yeltsin finally put an end to that only because of the election of Leonid Kuchma in July 1994 that brought a pro-Russian government to power, pro-Russian president to power in Ukraine. But then again, in 2004, the Russian government sought to maintain a fraudulent election in Ukraine that had led to the election of Viktor Yanukovych, and that was overturned through the Orange Revolution and the holding of a free election that led to the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko. In the next 10 years, there was, again, during all of that time, from 1991 through the end of 91 through 2004, Ukraine made no effort to join NATO. On the contrary, it affirmed its status as a neutral state, and public opinion was strongly against joining NATO. That didn't keep Putin from intervening in 2004 and then again in 2014. Now, even though Ukrainian leaders did bring up in 2008 the prospect of joining NATO, there was not public support for it. And in fact, NATO did not give a membership action plan to Ukraine at the time. It made a declaration that was mostly a way of trying to put off any consideration of the issue. So then in March of 2010, the Ukrainian government adopted a law prohibiting any foreign alliances for Ukraine, and that law remained in effect until December 2014, well after the Maidan revolution was over. So anyone who tells me that this is just about NATO and the prospect of having Ukraine join NATO, the empirical record doesn't bear that out. It shows just the opposite, that at the very time that Ukraine had affirmed itself as a neutral state, Russia was intervening in its affairs, and it continued to do so even after the Ukrainian government had adopted a law barring any participation in military alliances. So it's not to say that NATO is entirely irrelevant, but it certainly couldn't be the predominant reason that Putin keeps on trying to imply it is. It really does have to do much more with the kind of view that Putin has of Ukraine, which is entirely dismissive and sees it as no more than a vassal and subordinate of Russia. When Putin publishes statements as he did last July, in July of 2021, or his recent speech last week, in which he basically claimed that Ukraine never had an existence as a separate nation and was always part of Russia. I think it's entirely untrue. It's historical nonsense. But his view of Ukraine has been so poisoned that I think he actually believes it. And combined with the prospect that Ukraine over the last 8 years has moved, it certainly has had many problems, but it had moved toward being a much more democratic country, and even reasonably successful country in some respects. Although, again, I don't want to say that it was a thriving democracy. It wasn't, but it certainly was a lot closer to it over the last 8 years than it had been before that. But so it's the prospect that Ukraine might set an example that then a lot of Russians would think about emulating, and that's what I think that Putin in particular wanted to ensure would never happen. But there's also one last comment that I might make. There's a colleague of mine pointed this out, is that Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, centuries ago, destroyed Novgorod which an event that set Russia back for really several hundred years. He destroyed Novgorod in an act of malevolent vengeance. And there's some parallel you can see here with the way that Putin is treating Ukraine, just as he earlier treated Georgia. There's this kind of vengeful aggressiveness that he has, where he wants to lash out at those he sees who don't have sufficient respect for him. So it's partly for that reason that I fear that things are going to go very badly now in terms of loss of life and the extent of destruction that will occur. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I am quite fearful that we're going to see a Novgorod type repetition. Let me finally just mention that with regard to what Ivan Krestov said, there's no question that Putin would like some reordering of the security architecture in Europe that would basically ensure that there'd be a return to the early 90s and Russia would be able to exert hegemony over much of Central and Eastern Europe. That will never happen. That's not going to happen. And the Russian government kept raising the issue in the lead up to the war, but I see that more as a kind of pretext or a rationale for actions that are being taken for other reasons. Tatiana, you're muted.
I want to remind you, Mark, of something you have said probably around 2006 in one of your written essays about how the events shape up in the former Soviet Union. Unless I'm mistaken, correct me, please. You said that there isn't a single neighboring country that Russia has not been able not to alienate. So it quarreled practically with all its neighbors at that time, as early as 2005 or 2006. This is my recollection when you wrote that. And I tend to agree with Joshua that the threat of democratic development in a neighboring country and the country with which Russia has so many ties on practically every level, and most of all on a human level, such as Ukraine, is terrifying to Putin. There is no doubt in my mind. But there is also an aspect, I think, of which I alluded to in my statement earlier today, the small victorious war in along the way to the next election in Russia, the presidential election. This is what Putin felt he needs. And he actually, let's not forget that he gets the support of majority of population, and I know it for a fact, in spite of the huge scale of protests in Russia, and protests both physical, when people pour into the streets and squares of Russian major cities, also the amount of signatures that have been submitted for various appeals and statements has been absolutely unprecedented. But in spite, with all this notwithstanding, we still have the majority of population supporting, including highly educated people, people with two, high educations. I have among my classmates in my special English language school, which I graduated in 1967. These people, most of whom occupy fairly important positions within mass media, within educational system, some of them professors or at least instructors in foreign languages and so forth. most of them support it, and they are what we call kvasnoy patriotism. They have the most chauvinistic type of patriotic behavior displayed by these people. So let's not fool ourselves. And there is a lot of support for Putin, but not unlike Yeltsin, but for different purposes, different motives, different justification and thinking. He wants to wage this war and these threats in order to continue to impress the electorate, that fraction of population that will support him during the next presidential campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I would just a quick word on that is there's no question that as in most of the events, because Putin has waged a lot of wars. He came into office as prime minister in August 1999, and within just days later was involved in trying to coordinate the repulsion of attacks launched by Chechen-led insurgents from Chechnya into Dagestan. And that was done, albeit with considerable difficulty. The MVD didn't perform particularly well then, but that was done. And then the next month with the apartment bombings that Putin attributed to Chechens, even though again the circumstantial evidence suggests that it may well have been the Russian government itself that perpetrated those bombings. I won't go into that now, except to say that that then became the pretext for a major operation incursion into Chechnya, the destruction of Grozny, and the civil war that followed. They are killing tens of thousands. Ultimately, it did succeed in consolidating Russian control over Chechnya, which nowadays, for the last 15 years, has been under the tyrannical rule of Ramzan Kadyrov, a really nightmarish leader who makes Chechnya a bizarre place, and it is part of the Russian Federation, but Putin has given him free rein to terrorize that republic. So war in that instance was instrumental in domestic repression as well. And then more recently, the August 2008 war against Georgia, which I briefly mentioned before, Russia's military operations against Ukraine in 2014, Russian military operations in Syria starting in September 2015, the Russian state-supported mercenaries, the Wagner Group, which have been involved in Libya and in Mali over the last couple of years, that there are many ways in which one of Putin's standard tactics in office has been war. It is a thing he knows. It's a thing the use of violence is clearly something he believes in, and that is again why he is so willing as well to use violent repression against his own population, even if not quite on the destructive scale that he is abroad.
Thank you very much, all of you. I'm taking the floor from Tatiana's last comments, and I have here a few more questions. One of the questions is connected with Putin's speeches and his rhetorical messages, and it is a question that comes from Professor of Rhetoric Noemi Marin, who has been studying Putin's speeches and his messages to his people since the inception of his presidency. So she is asking, this is to all of you, Putin's rhetorical move, she says, to become the Russian redeemer of history, legitimacy and national pride has gained him popularity. He still has, as Tatiana also stressed on this fact. Why are there so few studies of his rhetorical moves that, in a sense, justify his position? And I want to remind you all that we have a few minutes left. Maybe this will be our final question. We had two questions or comments by Yefim Samin and Golfo Alexopoulos that were connected with predictions of Putin's moves. But as Golfo rightly mentions in her question, historians hate, as she says, hate making predictions. And that her question is going back to Stalin's era. She's asking are there any chance that the Russian military might act against the security police as he did in 1953? If maybe Mark or Joshua would like to very quickly to answer this question as well. I think that we are in a good situation. We have a few minutes left. So who would like to answer those two questions by Noemi, Martin, and Golfo?
Just quickly to Golfo's question about the military working against secret police.
Yes, please.
Yes, that happened in 1953, but the military had the memory of the purges, the terrible purges of its ranks in the late 1930s. And so they were more than happy to move against Lavrentiy Beria and others. But it's hard to say the same today because Putin has elevated the military in the same way he's elevated his own ranks and colleagues in the FSB, the successors to the KGB. So it's very hard to say where the opposition will come from. But as I said, as Trotsky said, war is the mother of revolution. And as things continue to go badly in Ukraine, badly in many different ways, we cannot foresee. This could undercut Putin's popularity. And other people have ambitions too. We shouldn't forget that.
Thank you very much, Joshua. You,
if I may,
I'm sorry. Yes, please.
I just wanted to say that Putin managed to maneuver his close circles and who he is surrounded by such mediocrities that we could see at his Security Council, the people who were not even able to word together a complete sentence and were like mesmerized by him into mumbling and nodding. And I do not see anyone at least in that milieu who would be able to withstand. But we do have those two oligarchs who spoke against. And even prior to the invasion, we did have people from the military society, which is one of the most stalwart, the most conservative, and I would say even backward institutions in Russia, who did condemn the very idea of starting the war with Ukraine. So while I do not see much reason for optimism right now, we could still see some resistance to Putin's plans and possibly even open protests from these circles.
Thank you very much.
Tatiana was referring to General Ivashov, who was in the 1990s. He was one of the ultra hardliners who would always speak very vociferously against the West. And he was forced out by Putin in 2001 and has since taken a strong stance against the corruption and abuses under Putin. And he issued a very strong statement in early February, denouncing what he saw as the coming war, and it's worth looking at. With regard to the question raised by, even though again, Ivashov's been out of power for 21 years, so it's not to say it's going to change things on its own, but I think he spoke for certain segment of society. With regard to Noemi Marin's question about rhetoric, I take very seriously Putin's rhetoric. That's why when I saw the article that he published last July about Ukraine that was full of historical nonsense and reflected this vindictive attitude toward Ukraine, I took it very seriously and was worried about what would be happening. And then because it came as military mobilization had already begun going back to last spring. And then again, if you look at the speech that Putin gave last week, that amounted to a hateful rant that basically denied any legitimacy to the Ukrainian nation and attributed any accomplishments it had to Russia. It's really, the rhetoric is very disturbing that Putin uses. It's not new in the sense that the early days really of the war in Chechnya, going back to 1999 and 2000, when Putin had been brought in by Yeltsin as his successor, and then was elected president of Ukraine in March 2000. Was elected president of Russia, I'm sorry, in March 2000. He was using crude expressions of wiping out Chechen insurgents, even in, I'll use the polite phrase, even in their outhouses. That's not the phrase the word that Putin used, but I won't make this X-rated video. So Putin has used crude language when he thinks it will appeal to Russians' baser instincts, and he has used violent imagery to convey a kind of enemy image, and he uses that about the West at various points, particularly over the last decade. So there is a very disturbing pattern to his rhetoric that I think has been looked at by scholars like Brian Taylor in his Code of Putinism and others. But when you see those kinds of statements that Putin issues, they are, they have to be taken seriously. With regard to prospect, I don't really see that I think the military, the Russian armed forces, probably the commanders want to redeem themselves after an embarrassing start for them, in which they have failed at almost every step that should have been taken at the outset of a military operation. I do fear the opposite. Not only will they not try to move against Putin, but they're going to go along with his effort to do terrible destruction in Ukraine. And I'm very worried about the bloodshed that is possibly going to be coming. Again, I'm desperately hoping I'm wrong about that. But after I witnessed what was done in Chechnya, which was part of Russia, I don't underestimate Putin's willingness to engage in the kind of malevolent vengeance that Ivan Grozny did against Novgorod several hundred years ago. And I fear that we may be seeing some sort of repetition of that in the future.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you very much, Mark. With this, you also answered to the two questions that Yefim Somin asked. They were connected connected to the reaction of this on oligarchs in Russia. Thank you very much for your comments and answers today. With this, unfortunately, I have to close our seminar. We spoke today about two very extremely extremely complicated issues that are connected, unfortunately, set topics, and it is sad and unfortunate that diplomacy failed. We are inviting our audience to follow our next events at the Sakharov seminars events at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. With this, thank you all. Thank you, our participants, and thank you, our audience. And